The Dark Ages were never truly dark, not for everyone. While kings waged war and cities crumbled, far from the roar of politics and conquest, a quieter resistance unfolded. It didn't wear armor, it didn't carry swords. It wielded ink tucked away in remote corners of Europe, on windswept islands like Iona, in stone-walled abbeys nestled in Irish mist, or deep within alpine valleys. Monks, scribes, and scholars fought a battle of their own. Not for land, not for gold, but for memory, they copied, line by line, word by word, letter by painstaking letter, Greek philosophy, Roman law, medical treatises, scripture, astronomy, epic poetry. Sometimes even cookbooks or agricultural manuals, pages of ancient knowledge saved from the jaws of oblivion not by kings, but by candlelight and patience. Imagine the scene. A cold scriptorium, the only warmth from the breath of the man hunched over parchment. His fingers are numb, his eyes strained, but he keeps writing, because he knows if he stops, the past disappears. Some of the most important texts of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Cicero didn't survive in their original forms. They lived on because a monk in Lindisfarne or a scholar in Monte Cassino believed they were worth the labor. Worth preserving, even as Vikings burned coastal monasteries, even as plagues crept through the hills. But it wasn't just Latin Europe. In the East, the great cities of the Islamic world, Baghdad, Cordoba, Toledo, Damascus, became centers of translation and intellectual revival. Muslim scholars didn't just preserve Greek works, they expanded them. Al-Khwarizmi gave us algebra, Avicenna redefined medicine, Alhazen laid the foundation for optics. In the heart of what some Europeans called a dark world, a blaze of enlightenment burned brightly. Meanwhile, Jewish scribes traveled between worlds, translating, interpreting, and preserving texts across languages, bridging ancient wisdom from Hebrew, Greek, Arabic, and Latin. And when centuries later the Renaissance bloomed in Italy, it didn't appear out of nowhere. It was fed drop by the steady stream of forgotten pages, smuggled knowledge, and fragile parchments that had crossed continents and generations. We often think of knowledge as power, but in these centuries knowledge was resistance, to forgetfulness, to decay, to silence, and it was fragile. One dropped torch, one raid, one moment of carelessness, and it was gone forever. Some works we only know by title, referenced in letters or commentaries, their content lost, their voice silenced, but others survived, because someone often anonymous believed they mattered. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they often conjure images of rusted swords, superstition, and stagnant minds. But beneath the fog of war and religion, the gears of innovation were quietly turning, and sometimes they were made of actual gears. Let's begin with water. In 12th century France, you might have heard the steady churning of a water wheel echoing from the valley below a monastery. These weren't crude tools, they were sophisticated, large-scale engineering feats. Monasteries harnessed water not just to grind grain, but to full cloth, press oil, power bellows, and even run sawmills. Some historians call them the first industrial complexes in Europe. And they were operated not by kings, but by monks. Then there was the clock. In our modern world, we take time for granted. We divide our days into hours and minutes as if it were second nature. But before the 14th century, time was the sun, the seasons, and the ringing of church bells. That changed when engineers in Europe, particularly in Italy and England, began building mechanical clocks. These clocks didn't just toll the hours, they represented a profound mental shift, the belief that time itself could be measured, ordered, and controlled. And yes, these clocks were enormous. Towering wooden structures filled with iron gears and counterweights, their mechanisms ticking away in the bell towers of town squares. They weren't just timekeepers, they were symbols of mastery, of a society beginning to understand the world not through mystery, but through mechanics. But the most forgotten innovations were often the most practical. In the Islamic world, engineers like Al-Jazari created mechanical devices centuries ahead of their time. His illustrated book from 1206 detailed automata, programmable water clocks, and even a mechanical hand-washing basin that refilled itself. This was automation, born in an age we labeled dark. In medieval China, the paddle wheel and chain pump revolutionized irrigation. In Africa, advanced metallurgy allowed the crafting of intricate bronze and iron tools. In Scandinavia, Viking shipbuilders designed hulls that allowed vessels to cut across both deep seas and shallow rivers, blending speed with agility. These were not people waiting for the Renaissance to save them. These were engineers, innovators. Tinkerers in the dark, even eyeglasses, something so foundational to our daily lives, emerged from medieval Italy, likely from monks and craftsmen in Pisa or Venice in the late 13th century. They weren't perfect, but they extended the working life of scholars and scribes by decades. These inventions weren't flukes. They were responses to real human needs, to see better, to measure better, to live better. And they tell a story we rarely hear, that ingenuity doesn't need electricity or silicon chips or global networks. It needs curiosity, it needs pressure, and often it needs darkness to shine. For centuries, we've been taught that the fall of Rome ushered in 1,000 years of darkness, that the world slipped into ignorance, stagnation, and fear until the light of the Renaissance finally returned. But what if that story was never entirely true? The term Dark Ages was not coined by the people who lived through it. It was born centuries later, in the salons of Renaissance Europe, by men who saw themselves as reborn Romans and who needed a foil, something backward, crude, and unworthy, against which they could define their brilliance. To make their present look like progress, they painted the past in shadow. Humanists like Petrarch in the 14th century referred to the post-Roman centuries as dark because of the loss of classical literature. Not because people stopped thinking, but because the books he loved weren't being copied as widely anymore. It was a personal lament, not a global assessment. Later, Enlightenment thinkers took that metaphor and weaponized it. They turned it into a narrative, a fall from grace, followed by a slow crawl back to reason. The medieval period in their telling became a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when religion rules and science sleeps. But historians today are uncovering a very different truth. The so-called Dark Ages were filled with motion. Trade routes shifted, not vanished. Empires fell, but new societies rose in their place. The Islamic Golden Age flourished. China expanded, Africa saw powerful states like Mali emerge. In Europe, monasteries preserved ancient texts, towns grew, universities were born, and cathedrals rose toward the heavens. The darkness was never global. It wasn't even European, it was a patchwork of change, conflict, and creativity. So why does the myth persist? Because it's convenient. It simplifies history into a clean arc: decline, rebirth, progress. It makes the Renaissance look like a miracle, the Enlightenment inevitable, and modernity a triumphant march forward. But history is never that simple. In truth, the Middle Ages gave us things we still rely on today: the university, trial by jury, mechanical clocks, banking systems, the foundations of modern languages, the first hospitals, and even the idea of human rights, which began to echo through early canon law. And perhaps most importantly, it gave us resilience. The people of that time endured famine, war, plague, and collapse, yet still created, adapted, and dreamed. So maybe we need a new name, not dark, not middle, just human, 1,000 years of survival, invention, contradiction, and hope. That's not darkness, that's life. When most people think of the worst plague in human history, one name comes to mind: the Black Death, the terrifying pandemic that swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing up to 50% of the population in some regions. But what if I told you that the Black Death wasn't the first? Almost 800 years earlier, the world had already endured a plague so devastating, so deadly, that some scholars argue it changed the course of history, and yet we barely talk about it. This was the plague of Justinian, named after the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I, who ruled from Constantinople. The year was 541 AD when the first signs appeared. Ships from Egypt filled with grain and rats docked at the bustling harbors of the Mediterranean. With them came a silent killer, Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later haunt medieval Europe. The symptoms were horrifying. People fell ill overnight, their lymph nodes swelling into painful black buboes. Fevers raged, delirium set in. Death could come in just a matter of days. By the summer of 542, Constantinople was crippled. At the height of the outbreak, contemporary sources describe 5,000 to 10,000 people dying every single day. The city's streets were choked with corpses. The Byzantine government struggled to bury the dead, resorting to mass graves and eventually tossing bodies into the sea. This wasn't just a local crisis. The plague spread like wildfire, reaching Asia, North Africa, and all across Europe. It returned in waves for nearly 2 centuries. Modern historians estimate that the plague of Justinian may have killed between 30 to 50 million people. That's almost a quarter of the global population at the time. And yet, it's mostly absent from popular history. Why? Partly because it happened so long ago, its memory was buried beneath centuries of war, empire collapse, and religious transformation. But partly because the medieval world didn't yet have a framework to make sense of it. Unlike the 14th century Black Death, which inspired art, records, and reform, the Justinian plague left silence in its wake, and perhaps most haunting of all, it changed history. Some historians argue that the plague weakened the Byzantine Empire so severely that it could never recover, paving the way for Arab conquests, shifting the balance of power in Europe and the Middle East, and altering the religious and political trajectory of the world. So no, the Black Death didn't come first. It was the second act in a much older tragedy, and if we forget the first, we might miss the patterns that still shape us today. The most haunting truth about the plague of Justinian is not its death toll, it's the silence it left behind. Unlike the Black Death, which inspired vivid woodcuts, paintings of deathly processions, and macabre poetry, the earlier plague generated almost no cultural response. No great chronicles, no mass prayers carved into stone, just a sudden void. And yet, if we look closer, not at what was said, but at what disappeared, we begin to understand its lasting legacy. Across the Mediterranean, cities shrank. Major trading hubs like Antioch, once teeming with artisans, scholars, and merchants, saw their populations dwindle to a fraction of their former size. The elaborate mosaics stopped being made, public fountains dried up. Libraries were abandoned, their scrolls left to decay in silence. Urban life, once the symbol of Roman civilization, began to collapse inward, but it wasn't just the cities that died, it was confidence. Before the plague, Byzantium had dreams of restoring Rome. After the plague, survival became the only goal. Ambition shriveled, literacy fell, art became more rigid, more icon-based, more fearful. Even theology shifted from the grand narratives of divine destiny to increasingly apocalyptic visions of an angry God. Then came a deeper shift, harder to quantify but more corrosive, a generational trauma. For decades after the initial outbreak, the plague returned in waves, every 10 to 20 years for nearly 2 centuries. Children grew up watching their parents dig shallow graves. Young adults married and buried spouses within months. The idea of future planning became almost comical. Why prepare when you might be next? And so, what began as a health crisis became a civilizational erosion. Trade routes stagnated, agricultural innovation halted. Great families with generations of accumulated knowledge died out. In the West, this helped push Europe deeper into the so-called Dark Ages. But in the East, even at the heart of Byzantium, it flattened the dreams of empire. Perhaps that's why the plague of Justinian was forgotten. It didn't just destroy people, it destroyed the imagination of a civilization. It left behind not stories of survival, but generations afraid to speak at all. And centuries later, when the Black Death swept through Europe, people believed it was a new horror, a punishment never seen before. But they were wrong. The earth had already whispered that warning once before, and no one had listened. For centuries, the plague of Justinian remained little more than a ghost in the annals of history. A few scattered mentions in Byzantine chronicles, a cryptic reference by Procopius, but no clear picture, no concrete evidence. Some historians even doubted it happened at all, that is, until the dead began to speak. In the early 2000s, a new scientific technique changed everything: ancient DNA extraction. Using samples from centuries-old skeletons, mostly unearthed from mass graves in Bavaria, France, and even London, scientists began isolating genetic traces from ancient teeth. These teeth, remarkably well preserved, became time capsules. What they found shocked the world. Inside the dental pulp of plague victims from the 6th and 7th centuries, researchers discovered Yersinia pestis, the same deadly bacterium responsible for the Black Death in the 14th century. The very same, identical genetic fingerprints. This discovery wasn't just confirmation, it was revolution. It proved that the plague of Justinian had been real, deadly, and global. And not only that, it showed that why. Pestes had struck Europe nearly 800 years before the Black Death, evolving in waves, mutating subtly, and persisting in ways we're still trying to understand. But bones revealed more than just bacteria. The placement of graves, the rushed burial styles, the layers of lime dumped hastily into trenches, all told a silent story of fear, chaos, and overwhelmed communities. Some cemeteries showed a sudden increase in infant burials. Others showed signs of reburial, as if people tried to return months later to do the rituals properly, once the worst had passed. And across regions, similar timelines emerged. The first wave in the 540s, then repeated outbreaks roughly every 2 decades, all tied to sudden drops in population, in building activity, in writing. This new data forced historians to rewrite the timeline of pandemics. Before, there was the assumption that the Black Death was a singular, world-changing horror. Now, we understood it differently. It was the second act in a much older story. One where plague had already shaped civilizations, collapsed economies, rewritten empires, and left hardly a whisper behind. But thanks to science, those whispers are growing louder. And they're asking us to listen, not only for the sake of the past, but because these ancient pathogens still exist, buried, waiting. Imagine holding in your hands the broken jawbone of a man who died 1,500 years ago, his teeth still stained with the DNA of a killer bacterium. Now imagine feeding that DNA into a machine, reconstructing the full genome, bringing it back to life in a lab dish for science. This isn't a scene from a sci-fi horror movie. It's real, and it's already happening. In 2011, a groundbreaking paper published in the journal Nature revealed something almost unthinkable. Scientists had fully reconstructed the genome of the Justinian plague strain from 6th century victims buried in Bavaria. The work was hailed as a triumph of ancient DNA technology, a way to peer directly into the past, to understand how pathogens evolved, spread, and survived. But not everyone cheered. The question quickly shifted from can we do it to should we. Reviving ancient pathogens, even in a contained lab environment, comes with enormous risk. What if the bacteria escape? What if a mutation makes it more virulent in modern humans? Or worse, what if that ancient strain carries traits we've never seen before and for which we have no defense? Bioethicists, pandemic experts, and virologists are split. On one side are the proponents, those who argue that resurrecting ancient plagues helps us prepare for future ones. That by understanding how Yersinia pestis changed across time, we can spot dangerous mutations in modern relatives and even develop better vaccines. To them, it's not just science, it's survival. On the other side are those warning of a new Pandora's box. The memory of COVID-19 still fresh, these voices caution against tampering with nature's oldest killers. They remind us that plagues once reshaped the globe, and that even a controlled laboratory can't guarantee containment forever. And behind it all is something darker, something philosophical. By digging up the past, are we honoring the dead or disturbing them? Are we learning from history or playing God? The plague of Justinian was buried in mass graves, in forgotten fields, in places where prayers once echoed over rotting bodies. It took 25 million lives across 2 centuries, maybe more. And now, in the silence of cold lab freezers, we hold its echo in our hands. Do we press run, or do we let the silence remain? Long before microscopes, antibiotics, and germ theory, medieval people lived in a world where illness had no name, no face, only consequences. When the plague of Justinian struck, it didn't just kill bodies. It infected imagination. Picture this, a village nestled near the Rhine River. One morning, 3 children wake up with purple blotches on their arms. By nightfall, they're gone. The priest rings the bell. The townspeople weep. No one knows why. No one can stop it. The fear becomes unbearable, not just of death, but of the unseen forces behind it. And so, stories begin. They speak of the pest maiden, a ghostly woman in white seen walking through streets the night before outbreaks. Wherever she points her finger, someone is said to die. She's not a scientific observation, but a personification of helplessness, of the unexplainable horror. In some parts of Europe, people believed a dark fog signaled death, a cursed wind that whispered across the fields. They called it miasma, bad air, but to them it wasn't just pollution. It was evil made visible. They lit fires in the streets, hoping to purify the air. They rang bells to scare away demons. They hung herbs over doors not to cure, but to protect souls. And when that failed, they turned inward. Religious processions grew more desperate. Flagellants whipped themselves bloody, believing their suffering could appease an angry god. In monasteries, monks wrote feverishly, trying to decode signs of the apocalypse. In village churches, paintings began to show the dance of death, skeletons leading kings, peasants, and priests alike to the grave. No one was spared. But even amidst this darkness, folklore sometimes offered comfort. The story of Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows but surviving the plague, became a symbol of hope. People prayed to him, lit candles beneath his image. They told tales of miraculous recoveries, of children who survived after touching a saint's relic, of angels guarding certain homes. In a world without antibiotics, belief was medicine, and here's the eerie truth. Many of those beliefs, those images, those whispered tales, survived long after the plague itself disappeared. In villages from Italy to Armenia, oral traditions still speak of ghostly women who visit before death. In rural France, the term mauvaise vent, the bad wind, is still used today when someone falls suddenly ill. And in graveyards across Eastern Europe, stone carvings still show the dance of death, a chilling reminder that, at one time, death had choreography. When the plague of Justinian came, it didn't just ravage cities, it colonized the imagination. And though the bacteria vanished, the stories stayed behind, tucked into lullabies, prayers, and shadows. So the next time you hear a wind whisper across an empty field, or catch a glimpse of white in the corner of your eye, remember, for someone in the 6th century, that might have been the first sign that death had arrived. For centuries, the plague of Justinian was like a ghost in the footnotes of history books, mentioned, but never fully believed. Some historians even doubted it ever happened. There were no grand chronicles like those written during the Black Death, no museums filled with records. just rumors, just ruins, just silence, but bones don't lie. In the last 2 decades, archaeologists have started to dig deeper, literally, and what they found has changed everything. In 2014, in an unassuming construction site near Aschheim, Germany, workers uncovered a forgotten burial ground. Among the remains were multiple skeletons buried hastily in shallow graves, but it wasn't the mass death that shocked scientists, it was what was inside the teeth. From those ancient molars, researchers extracted traces of Yersinia pestis, the very same bacteria that caused the Black Death in the 14th century. Except these remains, they were from the 6th century. Suddenly, what had been legend was now lab-confirmed reality. This wasn't a fluke. Similar DNA traces of the Justinian plague strain have since been found in burial sites across Britain, France, Spain, and even Egypt. In Bavaria, archaeologists uncovered a site with multiple plague victims all buried within days of each other, young and old, rich and poor, side by side. It was a snapshot of a society overwhelmed. Unlike modern pandemics where governments track every statistic, this plague left no centralized record, but it left behind something more permanent, a scar on the landscape. In cities like Constantinople, layers of abandonment show up in the ruins, buildings half-finished, workshops suddenly deserted, entire neighborhoods vacated. In Egypt, papyrus records show sudden price hikes, legal disputes over property, and abrupt changes in labor force, all indicators of mass death. Even tree rings from that era reveal environmental stress, sudden climate shifts, drops in agricultural output, possibly linked to volcanic activity that worsened the plague's spread. Nature itself remembers. And here's the most chilling part, the strain of Yersinia pestis found in these sites. It's now believed to be a direct ancestor of the Black Death. In other words, the plague that decimated Europe in the 1300s was not a new monster. It was an old one reborn. So now when we walk through the ruins of ancient cities or study the bones beneath our feet, we're not just studying artifacts. We're listening to testimonies, whispers from those who died without a voice finally being heard. The forgotten plague is no longer forgotten. Thanks to science, it has a face, a name, a date, and most importantly, it has a place in our story. When COVID-19 swept across the world in 2020, we thought we were facing something unprecedented. But in truth, we were walking through a shadow cast more than 1,000 years ago. The plague of Justinian, long buried under dust and denial, has something urgent to teach us, and it's not just about germs. It's about the fragility of systems we think are unshakable, and about the human capacity to forget what should never be forgotten. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire was at its peak, politically powerful, economically thriving, culturally vibrant. But in a matter of months, one microscopic pathogen brought it to its knees. Food systems collapsed, labor vanished, trade routes froze, even faith wavered. Does that sound familiar? In 2020, the world paused. Hospitals were overwhelmed, markets panicked, borders closed. Families were separated by more than distance, they were separated by fear. The parallels are eerie, but they also bring clarity. Because if a civilization as mighty as Byzantium could be undone by a wave of disease, what does that mean for us? It means we are never untouchable. The Justinian plague teaches us that resilience is not built in prosperity, but in how we respond to catastrophe. The people who survived weren't always the strongest, they were the most adaptable. They adjusted how they worked, lived, traded, prayed. They redefined normal because the old world was never coming back, and that's our biggest mistake today. Trying to return to how things were, the truth is history doesn't loop, it spirals, it rhymes, but never repeats. The lessons are not about prevention alone, they're about humility. About remembering that pandemics are not anomalies, they are patterns, warnings, tests of character. The plague of Justinian left no survivors who could explain what it felt like, but today we have video, voice, written word. We have the power to record, to reflect, to prepare. So what do we do with this power? We remember, we educate, we build systems that don't just serve profit but protect people. We listen to scientists, not just in crisis but always. We prioritize mental health, community care, and collective preparedness, not just individual survival. The forgotten plague is not just a story of death. It is a mirror held up to the present, a mirror that dares us to ask, will we forget again? Or will we become the generation that finally breaks the cycle of unlearned lessons? That choice, unlike the plague, is in our hands. Not everyone perished in the plague of Justinian, and though most names are lost, buried in unmarked graves or faded papyrus, their existence echoes through the cracks of forgotten chronicles and the margins of ancient letters. One of the few recorded voices is that of Evagrius Scholasticus, a church historian from Antioch. He didn't just witness the plague, he survived it, but survival, he noted, came at a price. He watched his wife, children, and friends vanish one by one. This pestilence left no household untouched, he wrote. It came again and again, like a tide that never recedes for long. He described the silence of the streets, the stench of corpses abandoned in haste, the fear that even breathing could betray you, and the guilt of waking up when others didn't. But Evagrius also captured something deeper, the strange transformation of life after the plague. Those who lived were not the same people they had been. Some turned toward religion with a fiery intensity, interpreting survival as divine selection. Others abandoned belief altogether, unable to make sense of a world where the good and the wicked died alike. In Constantinople, we find stories of surviving artisans who turned their grief into mosaics, new depictions of saints and angels now carved with haunted eyes and sunken faces. Of widows who ran orphanages with trembling hands because every child they helped was a replacement for the one they had buried. Of soldiers who refused to fight again, traumatized not by war, but by watching their comrades die from invisible demons no sword could slay. Imagine a monk in the Sinai desert, scratching prayers into stone with fingers half paralyzed by fever. Or a farmer in rural Gaul, sowing seeds with trembling faith, not knowing if the spring harvest would feed the living or bury the dead. These people lived, they endured, and then they disappeared from memory. No statues were raised for them, no history books named them, but they are there between the lines, behind the numbers. And that's the cruel truth of survival during a plague. You don't become a hero, you become a witness, a silent guardian of pain no one else wants to remember, yet it is these witnesses who kept society from collapsing completely. They rebuilt, they mourned, they recorded what they could, and sometimes they simply held on long enough for others to begin again. In their unnamed courage lies a deeper legacy than that of any emperor. They are the reason we are still here. And now, as we face our own uncertain futures, maybe we owe it to them to listen, not just to the screams of history, but to its whispers, to the quiet strength of those who endured when all seemed lost. Because in every plague there are the dead and there are the forgotten, but among them there are also the rememberers, and today that's us. When science fails or simply doesn't exist, fear breeds its own answers. In the shadow of the plague of Justinian, entire communities turned to belief systems more ancient than the Roman gods, more visceral than scripture. They were desperate to understand what they could not see. And in that desperation, strange new stories began to take root. Many believed the plague was a punishment from God, a divine response to sin, decadence, or heresy. In Constantinople, priests led mass processions through the streets, chanting psalms, holding up relics, and begging for mercy. But when even the bishops began to die, fear turned inward. Rumors spread that the air itself had been poisoned, not just by rot, but by demonic spirits or evil winds. Some wore charms made of garlic, sulfur, or crushed emeralds around their necks, believing it would purify the breath. Others burned exotic incense or animal fat, thinking it might drive the devils away. And then came the scapegoats. Foreign traders, particularly Syrians and Egyptians, were accused of bringing the plague in barrels of goods. Some said the disease had been hidden in textiles, others swore it clung to coins. Jews, heretics, pagans, any group already marginalized became easy targets. In rural areas, witches and sorcerers were blamed. A woman with healing herbs in one hand and a black cat in the other could be dragged from her home and burned, not because she was guilty, but because fear needed a name, a body, a flame. But perhaps the most haunting superstition of all was the rise of what some called the corpse whispers. These were people who believed the dead spoke through dreams, warning of more death to come. Some began sleeping in graveyards, trying to hear these voices, believing knowledge of the future could spare them. Monks recorded visions of pale horsemen riding through villages at night, their hooves silent, their eyes weeping blood. Farmers told tales of black dogs roaming the fields before an outbreak. In Sicily, a child was said to have drawn a perfect circle of bones in the dirt, and everyone inside that circle died within a week. Were these stories real? Or were they desperate attempts to give form to chaos? It doesn't matter, because what they reveal is that plague was not just biological, it was psychological. It infected not only bodies, but imaginations. And those infections could spread just as fast. The plague of Justinian didn't just alter history, it altered myth. It taught people to fear the invisible, to mistrust outsiders, to cling to symbols and omens in a world where cause and effect had shattered. And in doing so, it planted the seeds of superstition that would bloom again 8 centuries later, when the Black Death returned. So if you've ever wondered why medieval Europe was so obsessed with witches, demons, relics, or signs in the sky, it all started here. In the silence after the first Great Plague, when reason fled and fear rewrote the rules of belief, history has a strange heartbeat. It lingers in the silence between catastrophes. Long before the Black Death reshaped Europe, before it turned cities into cemeteries and monks into morticians, there was another whisper. A quieter apocalypse. The plague of Justinian didn't just end lives. It bent the arc of civilization, and its shadow still clings to us. This plague was not merely a disaster, it was a rupture. A fracture so deep that it halted scientific progress, disrupted trade for centuries, and forced empires to retreat inward, terrified of the air they breathed. Once proud cities like Constantinople would never fully recover. The Eastern Roman Empire limped on, but it had lost something: its confidence, its momentum, its claim to eternal rule. But more than infrastructure and imperial might, the plague infected something subtler: the collective psyche of humanity. It taught people to expect the worst, to see death not as a mystery but a stalking presence. It normalized mass graves, it made suffering ordinary, and perhaps the most haunting legacy: we forgot it ever happened. For centuries, the plague of Justinian was a ghost in the margins of history. Not because it didn't matter, but because it happened to a world already slipping into silence. The Middle Ages began not with knights and castles, but with whispers of disease and the slow fading of light. So why does this matter now? Because pandemics don't just rewrite history books, they rewrite us. In recent years, we too have faced invisible enemies. We've watched cities empty, hospitals overflow, economies stall. We've felt the same fear, the same isolation, the same desperate search for meaning. We wear masks now not to hide, but to protect. We hoard supplies, we share rumors, we blame. Sound familiar? The plague of Justinian isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror, a reminder that beneath our modern machines, behind our science and screens, we're still fragile, still human, still just one breath away from unraveling. But there's another thread, because after the plague there were still gardens, still lullabies, still stories told by firelight. Humanity did not die, it endured, it mourned, it forgot, and then it rebuilt, again and again. So the real question isn't how many died, it's what will we remember, because maybe the greatest tragedy isn't the plague itself, it's that we let it vanish from memory until it came back. The silence after the fall of an empire is not like any other kind of silence. It is not quiet, it groans. It groans through broken aqueducts where water no longer flows. It echoes across abandoned forums where senators once debated the future of millions. It lingers in the hollowed-out hearts of cities, where once there were libraries, schools, theaters, and now only crows. The year is somewhere around 540 AD. The Western Roman Empire has already fallen. The roads are still there, but the trade caravans are not. The cities still stand, but they are shrinking, dying from the inside. Literacy, once the pride of an empire, now exists only in the hands of priests and monks. Most people, even the children of once great families, no longer read, nor do they need to. Surviving now requires something different. Silence, obedience, and superstition. But in a hidden corner of a crumbling monastery in Gaul, there is one man still writing. He's copying texts by candlelight, his hand trembling from cold and fear. The ink freezes in winter. Rats chew the vellum, and above him always hangs the fear that the abbot will ask what he's copying, because it's not scripture, it's science, or worse, it's Greek. Outside, the villagers have built a new church from the stones of a Roman temple. They tore down the old statues, naked gods and goddesses, and replaced them with crucifixes. They don't know who Athena was, or Mars. They only know that idols are cursed and must be destroyed. A boy throws a rock through the mouth of a broken marble philosopher. He laughs, but this is not just the death of a culture. This is the death of curiosity. The Dark Ages were not dark because of ignorance alone. They were dark because asking questions became dangerous, because remembering the wrong thing could get you accused, because knowledge was no longer a gift, it was a threat. You see, we imagine the collapse of Rome like a singular explosion, a dramatic end. But history rarely dies all at once. It rots slowly from neglect, from fear, from silence. The libraries didn't burn overnight. Some were just left unlocked, open to the rain. Others were sold as scrap. Others, the most tragic, were hidden so well that we never found them again. We tend to think of the fall of civilization as a disaster, but in reality, it's often a quiet suffocation. The phrase Dark Ages is a lie told too often, even by those who love history. It's a phrase that suggests ignorance, barbarism, and a total absence of progress, as if for nearly 1,000 years, humanity simply sat in the mud and waited for the Renaissance to arrive. But if you look closely, it wasn't dark everywhere. Not all the candles were snuffed out. Yes, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire brought about a brutal fragmentation of Europe. Roads became unsafe, coinage fell out of use. Cities depopulated, trade routes vanished like vapor in winter air. But that doesn't mean nothing happened. It means history became regional, smaller, quieter, harder to trace. While scholars in 19th century Britain dismissed this era as a black hole, people living through it were adapting. They were building, praying, digging, dying, surviving. They developed new languages, Old English, Old High German, Old Norse, all evolving rapidly as Latin faded like a ghost in the mist. Oral traditions flourished in the absence of books. Folk songs and sagas carried wisdom across centuries, truths passed not in parchment but in whispers around fires. In the kingdom of the Franks, warrior chiefs were becoming kings. In Ireland, isolated from Roman collapse, monasteries grew into beacons of light, preserving classical knowledge that would have otherwise been lost. It was Irish monks who painstakingly recopied Virgil, Aristotle, and even obscure medical texts, sometimes without understanding them, but knowing they were sacred in a different way. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, which Europe arrogantly omitted from the story, there was no darkness at all. Cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo were shimmering hubs of science, poetry, philosophy, and medicine. When Europe forgot the art of surgery, Muslim physicians performed cataract operations with precision tools. When Europe burned books, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad translated them into Arabic, and then later back into Latin, centuries later, to be rediscovered. But the European Dark Ages were not just a misinterpretation. They were a rewriting, a branding, coined by Renaissance thinkers who saw themselves as the rebirth of greatness. The phrase Dark Ages was their way of drawing a clean line, of erasing the past to glorify themselves. They looked back and saw superstition, dogma, and decay, but they missed the truth that even in the murkiest corners of history, people find ways to carry the light forward. A woman in 7th century Britain mixes herbs to treat wounds. A boy in Bavaria carves patterns into a wooden cup, the first spark of craftsmanship. A monk in a stone room chants prayers in rhythm, inventing music notation without knowing it. This is not the absence of civilization. This is civilization reborn in fragments. Rome didn't fall in a single night, it decayed slowly and then all at once. In 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. But for decades afterward, people still called themselves Romans. Coins still bore the eagle, roads still bore the name Via, cities still followed Roman plans, but something far deeper was unraveling, not stone, not marble, but memory itself. The fall of Rome was not just a political event, it was a psychological rupture. A civilization built on law, order, and continuity had suddenly lost its central myth. And without a myth, people forget how to tell themselves who they are. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that your country has ceased to exist, not conquered, not burned, just gone. The emperor has no power. The army is scattered, the mail no longer arrives, the census stops. You still live in the same village, in the same house, but everything feels smaller, shrinking, haunted. In Gaul, Roman villas turned to farms. Statues crumbled and were repurposed as building blocks for crude chapels. Temples became sheep barns. The aqueducts dried up, not from attack, but neglect. Knowledge leaked away like water through a cracked cistern. More terrifyingly, Latin, the great administrative language of empire, began to shift. Peasants mixed it with local dialects. The classical tongue lost its sharpness. It became French, Spanish, Italian. Each transformation a little funeral for a world once unified. And then came the real death blow, the loss of literacy. In Britain, within just 2 generations after the Roman withdrawal, almost no one could read Latin anymore. Stone inscriptions became gibberish, legal documents were forgotten in chests, laws were passed down by memory and eventually warped by it. The mind of Rome, its logic, its poetry, its system of thought, no longer guided the hands of the West. The great libraries were silent, and in the silence fear crept in. What happens when people no longer remember how a bridge was built, or what a column means, or what rights they have? They invent new truths, new myths, new gods. That's what happened. Pagan deities became demons. Roman stories were twisted into Christian parables. Julius Caesar became a fable. Nero became a warning. And the city of Rome, still physically standing, became something closer to a ghost. The Roman Empire hadn't just fallen, it had been buried under layers of forgetting. Its name would echo through time, but always distorted. Holy Roman Empire, Second Rome, Third Rome, shadows chasing a sun already set. History is rarely saved by heroes with swords. More often, it is saved by men with ink-stained fingers. After the collapse of Rome, Europe didn't descend into utter darkness overnight. Something strange happened. In the midst of that cultural decay, that forgetting, small points of light began to glow. They flickered inside stone walls, behind thick wooden doors, in places far from cities. These were monasteries. To the illiterate masses, monks were peculiar shadows. They shaved their heads, rose before dawn, and spoke in dead languages. They lived in silence, survived on barley bread and broth, and copied words no one else could read. They weren't warriors, they weren't kings, but they became the quiet architects of memory. In a world where the written word had almost vanished, monks took on a sacred mission to remember. Inside the scriptoriums of Ireland, Gaul, and Italy, monks bent over vellum by candlelight, for hours, for days, for years. Their only tools were quills, patience, and faith. They copied scripture, of course, the Bible in all its sacred weight, but they also copied Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, works that had no clear use in the New World, but still glowed with the remnants of human brilliance. Some monks didn't even understand what they were copying. They didn't need to. They weren't trying to use knowledge, they were trying to protect it, one letter at a time, line by line, memory as a vocation. In Ireland, cut off from the chaos of the continent, entire schools of monastic scribes arose. These were not the barbarian Celts of Roman imagination. These were poet-priests, philosopher-hermits, warriors of the mind. They illuminated manuscripts with intricate knots and spirals, a strange marriage of Christian thought and pagan art. The Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Codex Amiatinus, these were not just books. They were acts of resistance against oblivion, and they worked. Through the chaos of invasions, disease, and famine, the monks became bridges across centuries. Without them, we wouldn't have the plays of Sophocles, the logic of Boethius, the histories of Tacitus, the geometry of Euclid. The very idea of philosophy might have dissolved into myth. Monks didn't just preserve texts, they preserved how to think. They wrote in Latin, but over time began to add glosses in the local tongues, primitive French, Old Irish, Anglo-Saxon. In doing so, they planted the seeds for Europe's future languages and literatures. Every stroke of the pen was both a burial and a birth. Their monasteries became islands of light in a sea of confusion, places where medicine, astronomy, grammar, and theology simmered quietly, waiting for the world to become curious again. But the monks didn't do this for glory, they did it for God, or perhaps for the soul of mankind itself. It began with a silence in the sun. In the year 536 AD, the world dimmed, not metaphorically, literally. The Byzantine historian Procopius, who was not known for hyperbole, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. For 18 months, the skies over Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia were veiled in a strange, ghostly haze. Crops failed, summer became winter, and no one understood why. We now know, thanks to modern ice core analysis, that in early 536, a massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland or perhaps further east, blasted millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere. The veil it left behind wasn't a cloud, it was a death shroud stretching from horizon to horizon. The temperature dropped by an average of 25 degrees Celsius worldwide. That might sound small, but it was catastrophic. The growing season in northern Europe collapsed. Famine set in not for weeks or months, but for years. Imagine this, you're a farmer in Gaul. One day, the air smells of sulfur. The sun no longer rises with golden light, but with a dull, gray pallor. The wheat you planted refuses to sprout. The animals grow sick. Your children cry not from mischief, but from hunger. You look to the priests who say it's punishment. You look to the skies which give no answer. In China, snow fell in the middle of summer. In Ireland, annals record a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. In Mesopotamia, drought struck. In Scandinavia, entire settlements were abandoned. In the Americas, civilization stalled. Across continents, the world paused, but famine was just the beginning. The weakened, starving population was now ripe for the next blow, plague. Just a few years later, in 541 AD, the plague of Justinian struck Constantinople, spreading along trade routes ravaged by instability. That, however, is a story for another part of our journey. Here, in 536, something more primal happened. The light itself had changed. The human psyche was deeply shaken. When day feels like dusk and stars refuse to shine, myth and madness begin to whisper. Many believed the apocalypse had arrived. Others believed God had turned his face away, and in a way he had, or so it seemed. For medieval chroniclers writing long after the fact, this year became a kind of wound in time, a fracture, and it's no exaggeration to say that civilization cracked with it. Empires faltered, art stagnated, hope dimmed. And yet in the ashes something stirred, not immediately, not with grandeur, but over time, slowly, painfully, human beings began to adapt, to plant hardier crops, to pray harder, to fear more deeply, but also to remember. Because those who lived through the year without sun would carry its memory like a scar, whispering it to the next generation. There was a year when the sky fell and we lived. In an age when women were expected to be silent, unseen, and submissive, Theodora defied all three. She didn't just rise above her station, she transcended the very idea of what a woman could be. She was born not in a palace but likely in a poor district of Constantinople, sometime in the late 400s. Her father was a bear-keeper for the Hippodrome, the massive stadium where chariots raced and mobs roared. When he died, Theodora's mother, desperate to feed her daughters, brought them before the crowd to plead for help. From that moment on, Theodora learned what it meant to survive. Not just in the physical sense, but politically, emotionally, and socially. By her teenage years, she had become an actress, and in Byzantine society, that was little more than a euphemism for sex work. She performed in bawdy plays, sold herself to men of power, and toured across North Africa as a companion to a regional governor. But somewhere along that harsh road, something in her hardened and sharpened. She converted to Monophysite Christianity, a heretical faith in the empire's eyes, and began using her voice not for entertainment, but for conviction. When she returned to Constantinople, it was not as a broken woman, but as a force that could not be ignored. And that's when she met Justinian. He was the emperor's nephew, brilliant, ambitious, and poised to rise. But what drew him to Theodora wasn't just beauty, it was her mind, her wit, her fire. He saw in her not a mistress, but a partner. Their marriage scandalized the elite. Laws had to be changed just to make it legal. But Justinian didn't care. He didn't want a shadow, he wanted an equal, and that's exactly what he got. When Justinian became emperor in 527 AD, Theodora became Augusta, empress of the Eastern Roman Empire. Most expected her to sit quietly in the background, draped in silk and diamonds. She didn't. When the Nika riots exploded in 532, a violent uprising that burned half of Constantinople and nearly unseated the emperor, it was Theodora who refused to flee. As Justinian and his advisors panicked, she stood and delivered one of the most chilling speeches in imperial history. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud, I will not leave. If you wish to flee, go, but I will remain." That steel saved an empire. Justinian stayed, the rebellion was crushed, and Theodora, she emerged not just as a survivor of chaos, but as the moral compass of the empire. She championed laws to protect women, including bans on forced prostitution, expanded divorce rights, and shelter for abused wives. She defied church orthodoxy to support her Monophysite faith, even as it risked war with Rome. To some, she was a demon in disguise, a harlot playing queen. To others, she was a saint who bled for justice. But to history, she was a paradox made flesh, both ruthless and compassionate, devout and cunning, brutal and visionary. She died in 548, possibly of cancer, leaving Justinian shattered. He would never remarry, and he would never forget the woman who saved his crown and perhaps the soul of the empire. The fall of Rome didn't just shatter an empire. It tore open a vacuum, one that wouldn't be filled by cities or kings but by writers, silent, swift, and terrifying. From the endless steppes of Central Asia to the forests of Eastern Europe came people who didn't build marble temples or sprawling aqueducts. They built momentum on horseback. The first shockwave was the Huns. To the Romans, they were monsters, faces scarred in childhood on purpose, squat bodies born to ride, and eyes that seemed to pierce through flame. They came like ghosts, striking fast and vanishing, leaving behind only smoking villages and tales of horror. But their real weapon wasn't just terror, it was adaptability. Huns didn't need roads, farms, or cities. They followed herds, moved with seasons, and carried their world on horseback. Their children learned to ride before they could walk. Their elders remembered migrations like others remembered birthdays, and at the center of it all stood Attila. He wasn't a king in the European sense, he was a force of nature. In the early 5th century, he united warring tribes under one banner, forged alliances with Gothic mercenaries, and demanded tribute from Rome itself. In 452 AD, he reached the gates of Italy, and cities trembled. Rome sent a delegation to plead for mercy, among them Pope Leo I, and something extraordinary happened. Attila turned back. No battle, no siege, just withdrawal. Why? Some say it was a bribe. Others that disease had ravaged his troops. But some, especially the storytellers of the time, believed Attila saw a divine vision or was awed by the courage of the Pope. Whatever the reason, that moment marked the high tide of Hun power in the West, but it didn't end there. After the Huns faded, the Avars, Magyars, and Bulgars followed. Each wave from the east reshaped Europe's borders. They didn't conquer in the Roman sense, they absorbed, mixed, settled, created strange new hybrids of culture and warfare. They brought innovations too, stirrup technology, better compound bows, and new ways of organizing military units. By the time Charlemagne built his empire centuries later, his cavalry bore clear traces of the very horsemen once called barbarians. But perhaps the most misunderstood of all were the Scythians and earlier Sarmatians, peoples the Romans feared so much they adopted parts of their battle styles, their armor, and even their mythology. There are even theories that the legends of the Amazons, the fierce warrior women, were based on Scythian female fighters who could ride, hunt, and shoot arrows as well as any man. The story of the steppes is not just a tale of violence, it is a reminder that civilization does not always wear a crown or build in stone. Sometimes it gallops, sometimes it disappears into the wind, leaving behind only legends.